Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar. This is Richard Waugh from Zycus, and I'm happy to be our topic for today is
So we had some technical difficulty there. Let me jump in here and finish off Richard's introduction. Thanks for everyone for attending. This is part 2 of a webinar series that started about a month ago. For those of you joining this one and didn't have the chance to hear the first one, we will do a brief recap of the presentation, and also look forward to the Horizon event, which we will talk about here in a few minutes. First, just to do some introductions, my name is Ryan Walicki. I'm a partner with Nitor Partners. Nitor is a Cleveland-based source-to-pay consultancy. We've been in business for the last 12 years and have done a number of things across the source-to-pay spectrum, including procurement transformation, business case development, technology implementation, sourcing projects. I mean, you name it, Nitor has probably done it over the past 12 years. With me is Gary Stoddard, who's also a partner at Nitor. Gary and I run the business for Nitor across the globe. And Richard Waugh was supposed to be our host today, but right now you're going to have me for the next little while until Richard's able to rejoin.
And I've rejoined. Thank you, Ryan.
Oh, there you go. I'll segue back to you, Richard.
Thanks very much. So we've covered the introductions. I'm glad to rejoin you for the webinar today, and what I'd like to do is just give you a brief overview for our agenda. And what we wanted to do is sort of recap from a prior session where we introduced 8 key elements to source-to-pay transformation. So we'll review and recap those and then talk about how to prioritize and sequence a transformation, really phasing the overall approach. And then we'll segue into kind of a core topic for today, how to put together that winning business case, and starting with establishing a baseline of current performance, the as-is process, if you will, and then looking at setting targets, the to-be performance or desired state. We'll walk through some of the key metrics involved with developing an initial pro forma and really give you some good thought starters and good models for how to think about bringing to bear your own business case that's going to get green-lighted to go forward with the transformation. And speaking of those transformations, we'll share a few case studies of customers that have gone down this path and really walk through the approach that they followed and some of the benefits and results that they've been able to realize. So with that in mind, Ryan, let me turn it back to you to take us through those 8 key elements and how to measure them.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So for those of you that did attend the last session, and even for those who didn't, what we want to do here is just take a few moments and re-baseline what transformation means, at least in our definition, which will tie forward into this presentation. So from a transformation perspective, I mean, the first thing is defining what process or processes you intend to transform. So from a procurement perspective, the way we define it is across 8 distinct elements. So as you can see in this chart, from analytics all the way through financial management, capturing savings, each element has a distinct process that is an input to the next process. So quite simply, we all do spend analytics to understand who we spend money with, what prices we're paying to potentially do sourcing events, contract negotiations. There's a primary example of inputs and outputs. One of the things from a transformation perspective is understanding where you are and where you want to be, and then defining the roadmap to get there. So this chart is intended to, on each element basis and then overall baseline from an analytics, category management, sourcing, et cetera, perspective, where you sit on that pendulum. Primary to that exercise is weighting the relative importance of those processes to your organization. Typically, a less mature procurement organization has needs across the board, and this is what this chart reflects from a weighting perspective is it's pretty equal. Our more mature customers, clients, you'll find that they've invested time and resources in specific parts of the 8 elements, but maybe less than others, and therefore that's where their focus is, and the weighting would reflect that. But this is the baseline metrics to establish, from a transformation perspective, what is it you want to go do. Once you've sort of gone through that process, and this is an example, right, where, you know, we have some greens and some yellows. The greens would represent those areas in which you're comfortable that you've gotten as far as you'd like to at that time, that the process has worked, the people are in the right seats doing the right job, and it's appropriately supported by technology. When you get down to setting priorities, just saying from a business case perspective, I want to focus on contract management, you know, really isn't enough in our experience. And when we get to the business case discussion later, you'll see some of the specific metrics we think are important to explain to executives the need for action. But at the header level, we ask ourselves some basic questions. Over the next horizon, where would I spend my time to create the most value? So you can always link things back to how CXOs think about things, right? CEOs are incented to think about shareholder value, CFOs the same way. So from our perspective as procurement professionals, we have stakeholders, not stockholders, stakeholders, but our goal is to provide the most value we can to them. So while contract management or spend analysis may create an immense value to us as procurement, we have to think about what does that translate to our customer base. Also, in every organization, speed to market is critical. So what things can I do quickly to make my customers' lives better and or increase my customer service level? There is definitely sequencing that needs to be considered. So doing, you know, invoice and payment automation before you do spend analytics can make sense in some organizations, makes less sense in others. So you want to take that holistic approach to say, I've got 10 priorities, what's the most logical way to sequence these things so that they create value? If you skip back to the brief comment about inputs and outputs, if you create an output before having the right inputs, what do you really achieve? So I think there's always that conversation and thought process to, what do I need to make this contract management or e-procurement system be successful from earlier elements of the process? I think to wrap this all up, it really comes back down to, there's a salesmanship to procurement. I think, you know, everyone on the call can agree to that in a lot of ways we have to, as a cost center, sell our value proposition. We have to make sure we have the right people to deliver. But ultimately, there's some politicking that has to happen. There's some selling. There's some baseline understanding of what we do to the other parts of the organization that takes place, which is critical to getting the priority agreed and ultimately the business case approved.
Thanks, Ryan. You know, at this point, wanted to just quickly poll our audience, since we've introduced these key 8 source-to-pay elements. Try and get a read quickly from our audience today as to what their top priorities are. So when we look at the 8, let us know which one comes to the fore for you. Is it spend analytics, category management, strategic sourcing, contract management, supplier management, e-procurement, invoice and payment, or financial management? So we'll give a few seconds for folks to weigh in, and, you know, unfortunately we didn't list all of the above, which may be the preferred response for many, that everything's a priority, but wanted to get a sense, is there one that kind of jumps out, goes to immediately to the top of the queue as an area that you really want to address immediately? So just a few more seconds, we'll close the polls and see what the early returns are. Ryan, Gary, any prognostications as to which you think might be the top choices here?
The invoice and payment, cash management be a pretty important topic for most organizations. So, oh, I'm wrong.
But in that case, you would be wrong, because it looks like at least for our group today, a third have listed e-procurement, the top choice, followed closely by strategic sourcing, spend analytics in the third position, and then the rest is spread a little bit. So Ryan, Gary, any reaction to what you see in the poll results?
Yeah, I think that the second and third choices are very common when we've been going into organizations and assessing the current state and future state. Like you said, it was interesting. Forcing the choice doesn't give a kind of different profile than it did on webinar 1, but maybe all of the above might have, people may have bucketed a few together, but it's not uncommon. I think the e-procurement's high compared to what we've seen in the past, but that just might be just the cross-section that's on the call.
Interesting to me as well, Gary, that since we're going to focus today on the business case component, certainly seems like in our experience that the choices here as priorities are really areas that tend to lend themselves to the more hard dollar, very rock solid business case, a clear return on investment from initiatives like e-procurement, sourcing, spend analysis.
That's a great point, yeah, and we'll touch on that in a few slides time, but that's a great point.
Excellent. Well, we appreciate the feedback. That's very helpful from our group today. So we wanted to talk then about this transformation. It's a major effort because it's covering so many different business processes across the sourcing and procurement spectrum. So for most organizations, it requires a prioritization that we already talked about, a sequencing strategy. So it's always helpful to kind of take the clean sheet of paper approach as a starting point, and this actually comes from Gartner's classic sequence of how they would approach it. And I would say the caveat being that this probably is a clean sheet of paper. And as we get into the discussion later on, we'll kind of identify areas where, you know, organizations may have already made investments to kind of get to or approach best in class in one area or another, and therefore have a different priority as a developmental area. So the clean sheet of paper won't always apply, but in this case, if you were starting from scratch, let's say, the recommended approach is spend analytics is the best place to start, to really understand what you're buying, from whom, and what quantities, to really identify where the opportunities for savings. So starting with that bedrock framework of spend analytics then moves into a category management approach to then execute and capitalize on those savings opportunities that were uncovered through the initial spend analysis. And taking that category management discipline and methodology through a strategic sourcing effort to actually maximize the savings opportunities that you can negotiate through leverage corporate agreements. Step 4 then is, once those agreements are in place, making sure you've got compliance to drive the demand to those agreements and actually realize the savings opportunity that's been negotiated in the contracts. So e-procurement is number 4, closely coupled with contract lifecycle management. So if you want to make sure that you're capturing the demand in a compliant manner, those contracts or corporate agreements have to be visible and available at the point of need as users are making a purchase decision. And the final step in the process as laid out here is supply-based management. You know, having rationalized the supply base, pick the most capable and preferred vendors, then managing those suppliers in a proactive endeavor to really capitalize and maximize supplier performance. So the one caveat that Gartner mentions here in their approach to the classic sequence for transforming sourcing and procurement is, in some cases, the need to cut costs immediately, for example, could mean quickly starting with e-procurement as a way to get a handle on spending and be able to then cycle back to some of the other efforts. So it's just one way to look at the approach, and as we said, there may be various nuances and differences from organization to organization that indicate a different sequencing approach. I want to talk a little bit then about the key source-to-pay value levers as a lead into our business case discussion. And this is at Zycus how we look at the sourcing and procurement process, source-to-pay process from the technology footprint standpoint. It really covers the 8 elements we've already talked about, kind of bifurcated, if you will, between the strategic aspect, things like spend analytics, strategic sourcing, contract management, and supplier management, and the more operational procurement, requisitioning, ordering, invoicing, et cetera. So as we kind of go around the wheel and picking that spend analytics as the logical starting point for a lot of organizations, that's a way to increase spend under management, get visibility to additional categories that maybe haven't historically been under procurement control, because a fact-based approach has been the best practice for organizations looking to extend the influence of the procurement group. So when you can go to your stakeholders with the kind of visibility that for this category, something like commercial print or legal or contingent labor, and uncover the fact that the purchasing volume of the organization is being spread across too many suppliers, too fragmented, maybe hundreds of suppliers instead of concentrating that on preferred vendors. That's the way you can get the business leaders to buy in and give procurement more control over those spend categories that increases spend under management. And of course, having identified those, e-sourcing tools can increase the throughput, the volume, and velocity by which you can execute on those sourcing projects and identify more savings. Putting those savings in place then through contract management, getting enterprise visibility to ensure compliance to those preferred agreements. And supply-based management is a way to continually rationalize the supply base, increasing the leverage, increasing that spend with preferred vendors. And then some of the other key value levers that will come into play in our business cases on the operational side, using e-procurement to reduce or eliminate the maverick purchase, the off-contract spend that creates contract and savings leakage. And this is a high-volume transactional process, purchase orders, invoices, and so on, automating those processes to reduce the transaction process cost. And by accelerating the whole purchasing and payment cycle, being able to actually capture a higher percentage of prompt payment discounts, perhaps P-card rebates on that spend as well. And then kind of closing the loop at the end, financial savings management as a way to track and get finance approval and buy-in on procurement delivered savings. So making sure that the procurement gets full credit for what's being delivered. So that's just a look at some of the key value levers that will be part of our business case discussion. So for that, Gary, I'd like to turn it over to you to kind of take us through the fundamentals of creating the winning business case for source to pay.
Okay, will do. Thanks, Richard. So before we go into the kind of the structure and the background of the business case, what's important in any change program, any change effort, whether it's inside or outside of procurement, first thing that creates a good platform is to establish the current state, the current performance, then establish the requirements of what the business needs and what procurement needs to change, and then importantly set some achievable targets. So let's go to the first point, the baseline. That should be measured through the source-to-pay assessment process, a process similar to what Ryan recapped on earlier from webinar 1, where you're looking at specific or all aspects of the source-to-pay spectrum, and through benchmark metrics on performance, you're looking at current state versus a best-in-class or a highly evolved procurement entity. Many of the benchmarks, there's many benchmarks in procurement. Some are very industry-specific. Some are a little broader and cross-industry. Some of the problems with benchmarks are they often have different definitions, and therefore they can slightly skew the numbers or the report outs that they show. So, for example, what one company classes as direct or indirect spend, or what they class as a saving, whether that be hard savings or cost avoidance. That can vary by company, can vary by industry. So these organizations that are pulling many benchmarks throughout the year, you're only as good as a consistent use of a definition, and that's why you'll see many organizations show slightly different numbers for the same metric. However, the way we view them is these benchmarks give a very good directional input to what some companies are achieving and how many companies are evolving to that point, rather than using it as a finite number that is there's only one number that's correct for each benchmark. So what we try and encourage when we're doing this process is the target, the third aspect of this, the target that's set is very different in year 1 to year 5. So when that implementation plan is being developed using the benchmarks and the targets that the company needs to achieve, often companies try to run before they can walk, and the year 1 targets are too aspirational and they were more suitable to a year 3 or year 5 target. So it's very important when you're doing this to build a roadmap that's not only achievable over the time, but is based on directional benchmarks that help drive continued growth and improvement in procurement. So to try and bring some of these points to life, let's talk about some typical benchmarks that help set what should be structure in a business case and what should be our targets. So if we move to the next slide, we've just picked 6 here as a talking point. There are almost too many procurement benchmarks out there that make it far too confusing than it should be. And what we've tried to do is to counter the issue of different outputs using different definitions. We've tried to normalize it and average it a little bit just to give an overall directional view of what most of these benchmarks show. So maybe I'll just bring a few of them to life. So the first one, spend under management, which the numbers are very similar to spend that's actively managed. The higher end performers, the organizations that have evolved through process and technology and skill sets, they're more up at the 90% plus range. Obviously the average is more around the 50-60 range, and those that are, in the old days, they used to be called laggards, but nowadays it's more, we use the term low or evolving. You can see there's a massive difference between the low end and the high end. Now, that varies by industry. So just to give you a couple of examples, the aerospace and automotive industry are in the 90s, kind of 93, 94%, whereas the petrochemical industry is more in the 80s, 81%, and the financial industry is more down in the 63% range. So it does vary by industry, which is why you've got to be careful using a benchmark. But that kind of gives a directional view of how many organizations vary across how they're influencing spend and how they're actively managing and have visibility into that spend. And if we pick a couple of others, for example, on the purchase order cost and the invoice cost, we have often done many of these assessments in organizations, and the benchmark there around $18 or $15 being on the cost to process an order or the cost to process an invoice. We typically see that in many organizations that haven't embraced technology to drive those numbers down, whereas after a change program that impacts the benefits in these areas, the companies start to see much lower end value to transact in this e-procurement environment, and can be down at the $4 or $2 respectively for both of them. And then the final one I'll just bring to life in terms of the number of suppliers. Again, this is very dependent on industry, just trying to give a directional steer here. Those that have gone through a growth period in their procurement, whether that be through technology or process or training, across the 8 elements, they tend to have a much lower supplier number per billion of spend, whereas those companies that are going through a early part of their evolution, and I'm sure there's people on the call today who are in that phase because the majority are, there are many suppliers doing the same service or same good requirement for an organization because there's lack of control, lack of transparency in spend, so the numbers are often triple or quadruple or best in class. And beyond the 6 that we've demonstrated here, there are many others that, especially when you're building a business case, can be of use to benchmark where you are now to where you want to go. So for example, the cost of the procurement department as a percentage of the total spend per procurement FTE, and how concentrated the spend is, how many suppliers are in the top 80% of the spend using the Pareto rule. So there are many things that are out there that help give us a directional guide of, well, once I've found where I'm at today, how do I target where I want to be tomorrow? Any comments, Ryan?
No, I think you hit it spot on. That benchmarks, you have to be careful with benchmarks based on vertical, especially. So I think you hit it all the main points.
So just moving on now, so we've looked at our current state, we've looked at some industry benchmarks. Now we've got to get down to the all-encompassing task of building the business case to justify internally why this change program should happen in one or all 8 of the source-to-pay elements. So what we've tried to show on this slide is what are the key metrics that we need to have at hand to be able to start building the business case. And without reading through them all, they kind of break into 5 or 6 areas. So you'll see some financial metrics that we need to obtain, some volume-based metrics. We need to find out how some of this spend is segmented, because that will impact what we do. There are obviously some costs, some current costs of what we do in procurement that we need to understand. And then there's some metrics around people, some metrics around process and existing technology. And whether that be looking at addressable spend, whether it be looking at the volume of POs and invoices, these key metrics help us use factual information and take it to a business case where through formulas and through calculations to look at current state versus future state, future cost versus current cost, future benefit versus current benefit, we can actually start to put a cost and benefit business case together. So there's probably roughly 20 metrics on there. There are more. These are many of the key ones that we tend to use time and time again when we go into organizations to assess the current state and build a business case. But they're critical to be able to explain to the organization and the executives of this is fact-based cost, this is fact-based numbers, and these are the reasons why we can drive change in the organization. Richard, Ryan, any comments on the sort of key metrics gathering?
Just to follow up, I guess, Gary, on your point about benchmarks, I think, when you look at this inventory of metrics, some organizations might look at it and say, gee, we wish we had systems that would give us visibility. We don't have the data. And that's an area where utilizing a benchmark in lieu of actual numbers may be a reasonable proxy for doing the business case.
Yeah, and it's a good point you raise. I mean, just to bring something to life, I mean, when we typically go and do this at an organization that either has an existing procurement function in place, whether that be 10, 50, 100, or 500 people, or has nothing and needs to build it, there is some work to go and find this. It's not normally readily available at the press of the button. Some things are easier to obtain than others. And just to obtain these key metrics and validate them is a chunk of work, because the last thing we want is to put a business case together for a client for a change program, and then it's very easy to people to pick holes in numbers when it's up on a screen versus the amount of work it takes to go and find it. So whether you're at a point right now of having this information to hand, or more than likely in the 80–90% companies that need to work to find this information, this is possible to find these metrics with or without being an evolved procurement entity with great technology at the touch of a button. That's a great point. Just takes some work. Okay, so moving on to the business case Proforma. So for those of you that were on webinar 1 or even through the recap that Ryan provided earlier, you'll see a very similar structure here in that if we're going to look at a change program, we need to look at cost and benefit, but also we need to look at people, process, and technology aspects to the change. So what we tend to do is split this through a cost assessment and a benefit assessment, and I'll give you a highlight now in each area, a high-level overview. So in the people section, you'll see things around we need to recruit people, or we need to move people internally. We need to train those people, and we probably need to do some organizational, structural, job-type changes and communication of that across the company. And that has some cost. So what we found is by working to flush out those costs, it gives the credence to the business case. It's a lot higher than just putting a lot of big numbers in front of people to say, look what we can go and save, because there is cost to change, as we all know. Moving on to process, depending on where your pain points are and when your gaps were in the assessment, there are processes and tools that are needed to help enable people and get training on to actually drive change across the organization. So based on the poll before, whether it be e-procurement, spend analysis, strategic sourcing, 80% plus of the organizations either have a low evolution or have nothing in these areas. So taking the time and effort to build the process and the tools to drive that change will come with a cost. And then finally, on the third piece of the cost is on technology. And typically we look at the 3 aspects of this. The first of all is the cost to assess and select, because there's some very, very good tools out there like Zycus has got an excellent suite across the elements. And if any procurement organization is going through a rigorous selection process to make sure that it meets the requirements, it meets the needs of the organization, and you pick the right supplier just like you would with any other spend category that's out there. Then there's a cost to purchase and a cost for the ongoing subscriptions. Then sometimes people already have some technology that is not necessarily a case of replacing it, it's a case of enhancing it. So those are 3 of the main areas to dive into. And as you'll probably know on this sort of template blank Proforma, each one of those areas in costs, when we tend to build them, and we recommend that anyone does it this way, that there's a bunch of assumptions and calculations behind each one. So kind of a secondary page or a secondary aspect to this is making sure that there's a high-level view, and then if people are really interested, they can dive in to understand how these numbers were calculated and what was the assumptions behind them. And then moving on to what captures most people's attention on any business case is, well, what's the benefit? What's the so what? Why should we do this? So we tend to break down those into 6 or 7 main areas of benefits. Some are more obvious than others, but just going from top to bottom there, getting visibility in spend, driving through technology, driving down that level 1, 2, 3, 4 categorization to get detailed descriptions to help make better informed procurement and strategic decisions with the category, and then going to market with a clear category plan and sourcing project. Those drive significant savings, which often gets the banner heading in procurement. So a good average of around 5 or 6% annual savings varies dramatically by category and varies dramatically by start point. that normally has a significant number in the business case. As you go further deeper down, there's lots of other value beyond that typical banner. In contract management and contract compliance, having the right processes and technology in place to improve management, visibility, and compliance to the agreed pricing as per the previous benchmark on contracts, that drives value rather than agreeing a price and no one's monitoring it and managing it. I'm just picking a few others in there. Take e-procurement, for example, because that was the number one in the previous poll. Many organizations have far too many manual transactional processes that generate high cost with a high volume. So by looking at e-procurement and the various aspects that come with it, you know, as a broad number, and again it varies by industry, between 1 and 3 is an average of 2% of savings for every dollar that goes through an efficient e-procurement, catalog management type of system, which when you look at the volumes that go through organizations becomes a very big number. And then other areas that people spend less time focused on, which have value, for example, in cash management, many organizations have not optimized payment and have not optimized taking discounts. And for a very quick change, it doesn't have to be a long monthly or yearly change program. Something like cash management can drive a tailwind on savings in a project in the first month or two. And this kind of framework is how we've typically, and it varies by client, but we look at the first year, the second year, and sometimes the third year cost of change. But most importantly, then we look at, well, what's the ongoing annual cost? What's the ongoing annual benefit? Because some of these costs, once they're fixed, go away. We try and drive the typical ROIs around this vary from 3, 4, 5 to 1 from a benefit to a cost, which I may actually have given away the next slide, but I do apologize for that, Richard. But typically that's what these spreadsheets tend to look like. And we found through doing this rigorous approach, through drilling down into costs, to really highlighting the cost of change and really highlighting the broader savings, the broader benefits, and not just in strategic sourcing, we found that organizations tend to resonate with this and see it as probably one of the more robust business cases that they get from any of their corporate entities. And it tends to pass a very strong test with the C-suite and tends to drive the results that the procurement change agents want to happen. Ryan?
I think the other couple of things just to point out here. I think in our experience, the hardest part of this process is just getting started. So our advice here is, you know, then I use a chainsaw versus scalpel analogy. Start with rough numbers and rough assumptions, and then you have something to work back from versus trying to solve this whole puzzle at once to a minutia. Just start with what you know, start with estimates and assumptions, and then go validate and correct assumptions where you need to. And the second thing, which is kind of the inverse of a financial business case, is the cost of doing nothing. I think oftentimes clients overlook that aspect of, if you guys want to promote a change within your organization, you have to also consider the other side of the equation of, what if we don't do this at all? What if we don't automate invoices? What if we don't have better visibility into our spend? What does the next 5 years look like in that view? Your current budget will increase. You'll have to hire more people to do more with less. I mean, there's another side of the equation that you can use internally on top of a business case to say, if we don't do this, this is a net impact of doing nothing versus investing this amount to get to this future state that we want to get to. So that's something that, you know, we've done a lot of work with in the industry, and be happy to talk to you guys privately if you want to reach out to us after the webinar.
Oh, good, great point, Ryan. Sorry if I've stole your thunder, Richard, for the next slide, but we'll see what comes back.
No, thanks, Gary. And actually, we want to do another poll with our audience right now. So we've kind of gone through what's really a best practice methodology for, you know, categorizing the key metrics, developing the business case, really assessing all the costs as well as the benefits. And this poll question then is intended to say, okay, what's the output need to look like? Kind of get a sense of what is the hurdle rate. And Gary, I think as you alluded to, one of the real opportunities here in procurement is, as opposed to some other functional areas in the business, procurement does lend itself to a very tangible, quantifiable ROI, which can help in ensuring that that business case passes muster. And that's the nature of the question here. We want to figure out kind of what is the hurdle rate. So which of the following best describes the targets your organization sets for business case approval? So is it A, 10 times or greater return on investment and payback in less than a year? Is it B, equally high ROI targets, 10 times or more, but maybe payback takes more than a year? And then a variation on the theme, ROI targets between 5 and 10 times return on investment, but again, a short payback cycle, less than 1 year. D being, again, 5 to 10, but maybe more than a year. And then somewhat less aggressive targets, E, less than 5x ROI, but payback in less than a year. F being less than 5 with more than a year, and then a couple of other choices. G being something completely different, other ROI and payback targets, or perhaps H is no specific ROI or payback target. Sometimes these initiatives are green-lighted just based on an intuitive kind of gut-level feel that says we don't really need the quantification. We know we need to do it, especially, as Ryan mentions, if you consider the alternative of doing nothing. And that is clearly untenable. So, long-winded explanation of the question. Hopefully it's easier to answer than explain the question, but interested in the kind of how the distribution occurs here across the spectrum. So looking at the poll results here, we see about a third are in that 5 to 10x range, and perhaps longer payback cycles than 12 months. Nobody's in the 10x or greater range, which is surprises me a little bit, and as well as the fact that fully a quarter don't really have specific ROI or payback targets. So interested in your assessments and perspectives, Ryan, Gary.
I think immediately for me, and Gary, I'm interested to see what you think, the 25% that don't have a specific target, my guess is, and I could be wrong, but my guess is, like we've seen many times, Gary, we set the benchmark in terms of what a business case means. So a lot of organizations, unless it's a capital project or a huge ERP, IT project, really isn't held to the same standard of what am I getting for this? It just gets budgeted, and it's another expense line item. So my guess is that 25% represents organizations that don't have the rigor below a certain dollar threshold of projects.
No, I agree, and I think we've seen examples where a different corporate department gets given X budget, and we've often heard comments from the CFOs or the CEOs, I don't know quite what I'm getting for that. And then you put this through a very rigorous procurement business case, and we've had a number of clients where the same CEO and CFO had started to make other corporate groups within the company start to follow the same rigor. So the irony is you go through a higher hurdle to convince people because you're putting more rigor to it, but we've often seen it create change in other departments other than procurement because they challenge people to meet the same bar. Good point. And I don't know about you, Ryan, but was looking at C, D, E, and F. I mean, it depends how we define the ROI and how it's measured, but I'm not surprised to see E and F because that's kind of payback in a year or more than a year. C and D are high, but again, it comes down to the definition. But I think a realistic payback based on what I kind of talked about on the previous slide, it kind of gives a pretty similar profile to what we've seen.
Agreed.
Great feedback once again. So briefly, what I'd like to cover then, having gone through this methodology, is kind of share a few case studies, customer case study examples of organizations that have been able to achieve the goals of the business case they put forth, get to that top performer, that best-in-class status, albeit with different approaches and maybe different priorities as they approach the business challenges that they faced. And the first one I'll walk through briefly. I won't cover all the details on here, but it's AMD, Advanced Micro Devices. And some of the challenges were really, somewhat unique and very vexing for that organization. If you think about the traditional market for an AMD with memory was the PC market. And I'm willing to bet, we don't have a poll question on the topic, but maybe half of you dialing in today have logged in through a tablet or a mobile device. So that's what AMD faced, is their core market for PCs has really eroded over the last few years. And they were faced with a challenge where procurement had to deliver efficiency and cost savings really to meet top-level business goals for maintaining corporate profitability, a key strategic imperative for this organization. And they also faced the double jeopardy situation of having to deliver more with less. Despite having headcount already below existing industry benchmarks, the mandate was they had to reduce the headcount and increase the savings simultaneously. So usually that's a prescription that says you're going to need to introduce automation as a way to get that kind of productivity. So from a technology standpoint, they really looked at starting with that step one, as we outlined, spend analytics, to create that single version of truth across their global supply management team to find savings opportunities, not just opportunities to negotiate cost reductions, but as is noted here, something as simple or seemingly as simple as looking at payment terms and anyone that's outside of the normal standard 60-day payment terms, converting them to the standard to really drive more effective cash management in that case. Leveraging spend analysis through e-sourcing. And actually in this case it was a replacement for a previous tool set where ease of use really yielded significantly higher adoption, 15% higher adoption, and therefore greater savings, a greater throughput of those savings projects through the e-sourcing approach. And then bringing it all together with supplier management, really having the ability to measure and track key performance indicators on strategic suppliers to scorecard the performance and make sure that that it's continually meeting those service level agreements and standards and getting 100% adoption of that tool, both with internal users and the suppliers that they were collaborating with. So you can see the takeaway here, the benefits are meeting that mandate for doing more with less, reducing the procurement labor by 23%, simultaneously increasing the productivity of those people, savings per FTE up by 26%, and rationalizing the supply base overall by nearly a third to get more leverage with those preferred suppliers. Another view here, this is a global pharmaceutical, and taking sort of a different slant on the procurement transformation here, looking at a single slice, if you will, one category example, and seeing how they leveraged a source-to-pay transformation and automation that provides spend analysis, sourcing through contract management, supplier management, and so on. And in the case of this particular category, IT staff augmentation, a baseline spend analysis first uncovered that it's a significant spend category, $35 million, but that spending is diluted across far too many suppliers, 40 suppliers just in that category. And there was no stopping anyone from adding even more from a supplier management standpoint, and no consistency across, no consistent discounting or rebate schedules from the suppliers. But taking that view of the category, starting with standardization, standardizing the job classes so that they could get comparable results when they're analyzing prospective suppliers, going through a rigorous sourcing, a multi-stage request for information, proposal, and auction process around the pricing components allowed them to actually rationalize that supply base from 40 down to 8. And the savings benefit, 35% cost savings, increased rebates, and much higher compliance at the end of the day. 90+% of the spending going forward is with those preferred suppliers in that particular category. And the last one I'll share with you today, Rockwell Automation looked at specifically sourcing and contract management as the key focus areas. And if you look at some of the baseline data, it's no mystery why. Very complex sourcing requirement in this kind of high-tech manufacturing space with bid packages that consisted of over 7,000 line items and a wide, diverse global supply base of over 150 suppliers. So very complex to be able to analyze that volume of bid data. And in the contracting area, really not having good visibility or compliance with standard terms or effective approval processes to ensure things like Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, for example. So this was the before picture. And with the transformation approach, with sourcing and contract management specifically, being able to make sure that they could support those complex online sourcing events within a sourcing tool that actually supports over 10,000 line items using the Zycus tool set here, and embed very complex cost models. So they can bring all of the sourcing activity online within the sourcing event, shrink the cycle time overall by about 2/3, and yield significant savings as a result. So it's cycle time compression, it's efficiency, it's being able to do all this within a single sourcing event instead of having to break those very large, several thousand line item bid packages up into smaller events that delays and defers the benefit capture. And on the contract management side, really being able to ensure that the process itself was Sarbanes-Oxley compliant, that there were standard terms and clauses embedded in the contract metadata, providing better enterprise-wide visibility to all the various stakeholders to the contract information to ensure that people are buying off an approved agreement. So you see some of the stats here, over 40 standard templates and multiple standard workflow approval processes that can be category or supplier specific, and a large volume of users adopting the tool, the people responsible, over 100 users for contract authoring. So yielding the benefits of obviously increased savings, reduced effort, and reduced cycle time. So that gives you a picture of what some of the best practice approaches are to building the business case, to realizing the benefits of the business case through the transformation project. I want to highlight quickly for you an upcoming event that's all about sharing those best practices. It's called Horizon, and it's upcoming very shortly here now, November 9th through the 11th in Amelia Island, and all the participants on today's webinar, if this is something that's of interest, would get a special promotional code and discount to attend that event. And speaking of that particular event, my co-presenters today have a special session really to further enhance and embellish what we've covered today, the secret sauce to procurement transformation, building a winning business case. This is a session at Horizon that will be hosted by Ryan and Gary to really delve into how to apply that best practice methodology and those key metrics to your specific business situation. So I think we wanted to make sure we had a few minutes left to answer any specific questions, either myself, Ryan, or Gary, and we'll take a look and see if we have any questions coming in from the audience.
Hey, Richard, there's one that came through the WebEx, which I can take, because I think it was one of the slides that I was talking about. When I talked about baseline today's state and look at requirements and targets, when I was talking about setting targets for the first year, third year, fifth year, There's two levels of that, and it's a great question that was asked. The question was, is it a savings or an operational target? Which actually is both. So in terms of how aggressive you can get on some of the benefits we talked about, that's going to grow over time, and typically we do 2 years and sometimes 3 years to capture that growth, whether it be sourcing or other savings, because as you put in more volume through and doing more sourcing projects or doing more change in e-procurement, that savings grows. And from an operational point of view, when we're planning change and we're looking at how we're going to measure change, we often put some key performance indicators around each of the 8 elements to measure change and to measure benefit, whether that be X number of X amount of spend is captured by a contract and that X grows over time, whether it be X number of supplier consolidation and that X number grows over time. Those targets that we talked about, 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, they're both savings and operations. So that was a great question.
Yeah, and Gary, maybe you can comment too on, in your experience, is the business case development and review process a procurement-led initiative when we're talking about a source-to-pay transformation? And what role does the finance organization play in that process?
Ryan, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So in our experience, the procurement team leads this effort. Now, from a sign-off perspective, it's important to get buy-in. So finance plays a critical role in agreeing on the accounting structure, so how dollars and savings are accounted for specifically. And then really, Richard, it gets to be more of a disseminated approach of, if it's an AP-related savings, we want the AP team to sign off on that saving. If it's a sourcing saving, we want the sourcing manager. If it's a software savings, where we're going to replace a software with another and there's a net savings, we want IT to sign off on that. So the best way that we've seen to get business cases approved is to make it everybody's. Make sure that if there's an assumption for a cost or a benefit, someone has a pen and they sign their name beside it, and they're from different departments. And, you know, organically you build consensus. You have key stakeholders signing off on your business case. So it's not a procurement's presenting this business case. It's all the different stakeholders have agreed that there's these costs and these benefits, and we agree to stay within, you know, plus or minus the margin rate, which is usually 5% of a business case.
So on our earlier poll question, I think most of the audience said the targeted ROI, the hurdle rate, is somewhere 5 to 10x. And whether or not that's a payback of more than a year or more aggressive than that, less than a year, you know, assuming that most organizations, especially if they're early in the transformation process, will generate business cases that show a 5x return on investment or greater. Seems like a no-brainer. What are the reasons, if any, that a business case like that would not get automatically green-lighted?
I think there's always the perspective of knowing what's going on around you. So, you know, a great example of a more technology-centric business case is an ERP upgrade, an ERP redo. I mean, we have to be fair and understand that there's always going to be initiatives that are competing with ours. And in some cases, those initiatives are bigger and broader, like capital projects, enterprise-level ERP replacements or upgrades. Those are things that cause pause for procurement projects at certain times. But honestly, Richard, we've not had a business case not be approved to start. So it may not start when we had hoped, given some of those other external variables, but we've not had a business case go through, you know, the review cycle and approval cycle and not start at a logical point in time. As Gary said before, it's really about putting truth to numbers, getting sign-off, and showing the value of procurement. And I said this at the last webinar, you know, procurement has a unique P&L view of the world that HR, finance, other cost centers just cannot provide. So we found the business cases around procurement, technology and process and people is a winning recipe.
perfect note to close on today for our S2P recipe and the winning formula, in that following this type of rigorous methodology, in your experience, you've never had a business case get rejected because it's so compelling. If you've followed this approach and put together the metrics, there may be timing differences, but it's hard to argue with the numbers. So with that, I want to thank you, Ryan and Gary, for all your insights and perspectives. Thank everyone for joining today and for participating in our poll results. And we will follow up with copies of the presentation. And if any questions come up after the fact, I'm sure our presenters will be glad to respond as well. You have the contact information here to reach out to any of us. So thanks, everyone. Appreciate your tuning in today for the S2P recipe.
Thanks very much, everyone.